Airship, almost 250 meters long. In the 1930s, it was the pride of German aviation. Its only rivals were the British R-100 and R-101, built to carry passengers to the far corners of the British Empire. Airships were, and still are, the biggest aircraft ever to take to the air. But after two major crashes, where the hydrogen inside them exploded, aviation turned its back on these gas-filled giants in the sky. These are the very hangars that once housed the huge British airships. 70 years on, they still survive today, near Bedford, 80 kilometers north of London. Within their cathedral-sized interiors are the ghostly memories of those mammoth airliners. But these hangars are more than relics of the past. For today they are witnessing an extraordinary rebirth of airships, promising a new era in aviation. As of old, there's fierce rivalry between Britain and Germany. Airships are now attracting huge investment, modern design and 21st century technology, paving the way for those forgotten giants of the past to rise triumphantly again. In a corner of one of these hangars, British airship designer Roger Munk has a manufacturing company offering customers a range of modern airship designs. This is one of his latest, the cabin section of a four-seater airship.
All ready now. We've got all the frames and that in, everything. Everything in the back.
When kitted out, it will be attached to the gas-filled balloon above and be used as a TV camera platform or for advertising.
Right, we'll take this right down the other end there.
Good job. Well done, fellas. Excellent.
It's the latest in a long line of airships designed by Roger Munk over the past 30 years. His pioneering technical advances have helped make modern airships as reliable and high-tech as any conventional aircraft. And with the lifting gas being non-combustible helium, they are far safer than the airships of the past. But they are also much smaller. In 1999, Munk thought of building an even bigger airship than the giants of the 30s. He had already been in competition with a smaller German airship 2 years before. Now he was about to compete with Germany again, over a truly mammoth airship, one to carry cargo.
The big challenge is to come up with a complete new transport system, worldwide transport system, which slots in between expensive, fast aircraft and slow but cheap ships.
Munk had his eye not just on the commercial freight market, but also the military. He imagined a giant airship carrying battlefield equipment right to the front line. Conventional military transport uses a mixture of planes and ships, and so equipment can't arrive at once, causing logistical problems for any commander in the actual theatre of war.
If you could come up with an aircraft which could transport something in the order of 500 tons, which is a complete military unit, and take it right into the theatre and land it wherever the task force commander requires it, right close to the jump-off site, you wouldn't have all this logistical build-up problem that the whole lot is delivered in one thing. Now, with conventional aeroplanes, you can't do that.
So, in 1999, Munk began to design a brand new airship for the 21st century. Meanwhile, in Germany, another airship company had the same vision. A giant hangar was already under construction in Germany to house a huge cargo-carrying airship called simply Cargo Lifter. The German airship is intended to transport large, unwieldy loads like generators for power stations directly from the factory to the remotest parts of the globe. ABB is the name of a generator manufacturer. Bigger even than the Hindenburg at 260 meters long, cargo lifter is designed to be like a giant flying crane. Never actually landing, it will lower its cargo from a height of about 100 meters, anchoring itself to the ground. While unloading, tankers will pump water into the ship to compensate for the lost weight of the cargo. Roger Munk was aware of the enormous challenges in building any cargo-carrying airship.
One of the biggest problems that airships have always had is they are essentially huge objects with not much power on board, and that huge size means an awful lot of windage. And to date, they have been pretty uncontrollable on their own, in terms of their own capability. Once they get down on the ground, they're fine in flight, but when you get them down on the ground, you've got to get it onto a mooring mast, you've got to take off again. They need masses of manpower, and that will rule them out for commercial and military use, full stop.
To overcome these age-old airship problems, Munk felt he had to come up with a radically new concept. His first design was two conventional airships joined side by side, but that evolved into a fat, wing-shaped craft. Breakthrough idea number one was that it should be slightly heavier than air, a sort of flying wing filled with helium which would take off and land like an aircraft. But because he wanted it to touch down anywhere, aircraft wheels wouldn't work, so he had to think of something else. Munk found the solution from this experimental flight of a Buffalo aircraft in the 1970s. In place of its conventional landing wheels, the plane was equipped with a hovercraft skirt to test what kind of terrain it could land on. This gave Munk his breakthrough idea number two. Don't use aircraft wheels, use hover cushions.
We placed the hover cushions out here, and then it became apparent all the advantages that we could get. We don't any longer have to land on a runway. We can land on virtually any flattish surface. I mean, these hover cushions can cope with 15, 20-foot undulations. It can span a drainage ditch, no problem. It can also land on water.
The hovercraft, the world's most successful go-anywhere surface vehicle, was ideal for Munk's land-anywhere airship. But it was to be filled with lighter-than-air helium gas. So how would it stay on the ground when unloading? He needed another brew. In the very pub once frequented by the airship builders of the R101, he and his team pondered the problem. When unloading cargo, an airship will always want to rise into the air as it loses weight. How to keep it on the ground? The hover cushions provided the final solution.
So what I've been thinking is, if we put the hover cushion into the underside of the hull, it's nice and stable, and then maybe, Reg, we could run the hover cushion in reverse to actually suck the thing down.
Yeah, I don't see that as being too big a problem.
Sucking an airship to the ground. Sounds simple, but would it work? An inflatable child's plastic ring gave Munk the first test of his hover cushion idea. Holes are put in the ring to allow the air to bleed out and yet still hover.
The general principle of having a tube that surrounds the hover area, the plenum chamber in the centre,
Plenum chamber in the centre,
and some air bleed on the underside.
the principles there.
Excellent.
Okay.
Britain still has the world's leading experts in hovercraft technology, and so it was to them that Roger Munk went for help with the next stage of research. He asked hovercraft manufacturer Charles Eden to build a brand new hover system, configured so the engine could both blow to make an air cushion and suck to make a vacuum. In April 2000, the tiny test rig was complete and taken up to Munk's hangar for trials. Despite all the new modifications, Munk could see that the basic hover system still worked. But the crucial part of the test was to come. Controlled remotely, the air inlet could be sealed and the engine run in reverse, thus sucking the air out of one of the chambers within the hover skirts. But would it actually suck the rig down? Remarkably, the answer was yes. Monk's new cargo airship could now go full steam ahead. Back in his offices, Munk completed the design of his visionary airship concept. Far bigger than the Hindenburg at over 300 meters long, its name, Skycat.
Now this is what all the excitement is about, the Skycat. And this model here shows the basic concept. You've got a lifting body shape, in other words, there's more camber over the top of it than there is underneath. In which case, if you give it forward speed, it generates aerodynamic lift. The hover cushions here not only serve as a very efficient landing gear, but the clever thing is we can, by reversing the fans, putting a very small amount of power, suck this thing down onto the deck.
Here at last was Monk's answer for the military. An aircraft to take a small army from HQ into the front line in one fell swoop. For commerce, it could transport a shipload of freight at over 180 kilometers an hour, and its breakthrough technology meant it could land without any ground crew or infrastructure, an airship first.
This machine here represents a whole breakthrough for airships. I mean, it changes the whole name of the game. We can move for the first time up to airships with 1,000 tons of payload, and we can ground handle them without any crew on the deck, no mooring masts, nothing. So we're back, in fact, we're not only back to where aeroplanes are in terms of ground handling, we're better than. We don't need prepared strips to operate from. We can operate this thing from water, onto water, or onto land. You can use it for disaster relief where you've got an area that's completely flooded. This thing can come down, touch down with 1,000 tons of payload. That's 100 times more than something like a Hercules can deliver. And it can operate very, very cost effectively down around where a lorry would be. I mean, we've progressively over the best part of 30 years cracked every single element of the thing. The Skycat format of hull and the landing gear was the last technology element to go in place. And we're ready to go now.
Chairman Sir John Walker, from his high-level background in the RAF, could see Skycat's enormous military potential.
The lessons that were drawn from the Gulf War and now recently the war in Kosovo and the Balkans has pointed again to the lack of strategic airlift. Certainly in Europe, particularly with the UK and even with the US, despite their pretty good capability. But if we're going to go into the new century with the military doctrines that both the Americans, the Europeans and ourselves are now putting forward, then we have got to do something about strategic airlift. And you need a very large strategic airlift to handle these problems. Our technology in terms of the Skycat series of hulls has given us a technology that can provide very high lifts, far heavier lifts than conventional air cargo aircraft, that will go for very long ranges. So therefore our technology has matured again just at the right time that new strategic airlift requirement has started to come to the fore.
Also coming to the fore was the German cargo lifter. Many thousands of individual Germans, as well as the country's industry and government, had become shareholders, and the project was moving rapidly ahead. Cargo lifter began by building flying models. This is the smallest. A 5-meter scale model of the cargo carrying airship. The full-sized one will be over 50 times longer. The model gave the public a chance to appreciate its advanced design, particularly the engines. The future cargo carrier is expected to have 4 main propulsion engines and up to 12 maneuvering engines to control the craft for loading. In the face of cargo lifters' impressive marketing, Roger Munk felt he had to mount a campaign for his own airship.
What we've got to do is make sure that we don't fall into the normal British trap of coming up with a brilliant idea and letting everybody else then steamroller over the top of you. And then to that end, I mean, the British financial establishment needs perhaps to be a little faster on its feet than it has sometimes been and take a little bit more of a long-term view. But one way or the other, you know, we'll get this thing up and running and hopefully, you know, keep the Union Jack part of the technology back at the forefront. I won't linger on
So
this
Munk the
too closely,
engineer
because it might give
had to
away
become
too
a
many
high-powered
secrets.
salesman.
But it is quite a cunning design. The aerodynamics on this thing are not for the beginner. They are extremely complex. It has the advantage that it's always heavy. It doesn't need any ground infrastructure at all. No mooring mast, no man on the ground waving his arms about. This is the first airship that I've ever had anything to do with where, for the first time, I'm pretty confident we can build the thing outdoors, which is clearly a plus.
A conference call with the top London finance house about raising money for Skycat.
I'm comfortable to say 20 million.
Gordon today has had very reliable indication that we could get in these more slightly modest amounts of capital that could be wrapped into this process if you know a way by which it could be done.
After months of fundraising, they finally managed to obtain enough money to begin the Skycat program.
There's nothing more worrying in life, I think, particularly to an engineer, than looking for finance. It's and anyway, we found it, so I can now focus on the mainstream effort.
But right next door to Roger Monk's hangar number 2, things were happening in hangar 1. This huge building had once housed the giant British airship, the R-101. 70 years on, the fabric had deteriorated. In April 2000, there were rumours another airship was being built inside. It looked as though Cargo Lifter had set up an operation literally a few hundred metres away from their British competitor. Meanwhile, things were also moving ahead next door. From his corner of the building, Munk was expanding operations. Money had now come in from investors, and the company was growing fast. At his headquarters nearby, Munk took over more premises to house his newly recruited design staff. Munk knew his revolutionary Skycat concept would take huge amounts of research and development, and he and his staff were keen to get started on building a prototype.
Yeah, give me a look.
In Germany, Cargo Lifter's preparations for fundraising were already well underway. Heading up their top executives was CEO Dr. Karl von Gablenz. Press conferences like this one were part of their fundraising campaign in order to raise interest not only in Germany but abroad. Some of the publicity reached Britain. Roger Munk realized he had to make a move.
Now what we've got to do is mount our own PR campaign and take them on at their own game.
Monk's engineers were set a daunting schedule. He gave them just 2 months to build a flying scale model of Skycat, and yet so far they only had outline drawings. Munk wanted maximum publicity for Skycat, and fast.
Super, good. So we want that for our press conference.
Within a few days, the fabric for a flying model of Skycat was being cut. Back in Monk's hangar, hull designer Luke Brook briefed his team on how they would build the 12-metre test model of Skycat. Their deadline was June 15th, just 4 weeks away. Because of the airship's complex shape, nearly 100 separate hull sections had to be stuck together, making it the most extraordinary looking airship in history. Within 2 weeks, the hull was complete, but inside there were problems. Some of the rapidly assembled joins were coming apart. On a full-sized airship, the seams are permanently bonded by heat sealing, but on the small-scale models, heat bonding couldn't have coped with the unusually sharp curves. And so, to stop it leaking, virtually every major join had to be resealed with rivets. If Roger Munk was worried by the delay, he wasn't showing it.
It's coming together well. There were a few technical issues that they put right inside it, and I think we've lost 2 or 3 days and all that, and we'll be flying by Tuesday, Wednesday later, so it's getting a little bit tight.
All right, let's go for him. 10 to 3.
With all the seams now sealed, the baby Skycat, already dubbed Sky Kitten, could be filled with helium and achieve its final shape. But that was just the beginning. There were many things to add on. The hover skirts, the mounts for the engines, and the engines themselves. The styling. It was being built primarily for proper test flights, but before that there was the publicity press launch, so Sky Kitten had to look good. And to show that it was a new kind of aircraft, the word airship was dropped. Now the company was Advanced Technologies. But despite the haste, there was much still to do. Press day was now only a week away. Just then, things began happening in the hangar next door. In June 2000, the huge doors started to open, and out came an airship. The name on its side, Cargo Lifter. The world's currently biggest airship was coming out to meet its own publicity deadline in Germany. What kind of airship was it? Airship connoisseurs immediately recognized its similarity to a Skyship 600, the biggest airship in the world. The old R101 hangar was virtually the only available space in Europe to build it. Cargo Lifter said they wanted the ship for a number of reasons, foremost among them to train their airship pilots. After all, the Skyship was already airworthiness certified, and it also had a fly-by-wire flight control system, similar to the one on the future cargo carrier, so it made sense to choose it as a training vehicle. And the fact that Cargo Lifter were already preparing to train pilots in it implied that the company were well on the way to building their future cargo carrier. And their hangar was taking shape too. Like the airship that will be built inside it, it's a technological first, something that Cargo Lifter were clearly proud of. At over 100 meters high and 200 wide, it is in fact the largest freestanding hangar in the world. Meanwhile, in Roger Munk's hangar, things were also moving ahead. By now, the hovercraft engineers were assembling Sky Kitten's hover engines.
Yeah, yeah.
The engines were housed under the model in what would be the cargo bay in the full-size version. It was a relatively crude assembly, but it worked. However, time was marching on. Roger Munk was worried. The press conference was just a few days away, and Sky Kitten wasn't nearly completed. He was determined it had to be ready in time to get at least one successful flight for the press.
They're just building the
lake here. I just said, why don't we have a lake to land the thing on? And there's a lake here. I mean, you know, the lake's going better than the first flight at the moment, but I think we might actually have a waterborne landing. I mean, the lake's getting quite big now.
By the next day, Sky Kitten had its back engines on and component testing could begin. But with only 2 days to the press launch, Munk was desperate to get it flying. And so was his senior engineer, Mike Durham.
Yes, we most definitely are. This vehicle is flying tonight, so do what you've got to do. Get it flying.
But then, suddenly, crisis.
Everybody quiet!
To keen-eared hull designer Luke Brook, it sounded like Sky Kitten had sprung a leak.
Get the cameras out of here.
Gaffer tight, quick! Fine, just chuck it under here.
At this stage of the game, it was a potential disaster. All the team could do was emergency repairs. But would they hold when Sky Kitten was re-inflated?
Getting anything, Mike?
1.2, 1.3, 1.4.
What had gone wrong?
Okay, Luke, that'll do.
Luke Brook,
A theme went when you hear a hissing noise. One tends to jump first and then think, oh, it's probably not so bad later.
but the incident put an already tight schedule back hours, which meant work had to continue far into the night. For tomorrow was the last day before the press conference. Sky Kitten simply had to fly. And the next morning, it was finally finished. Light enough to be carried by a few men, Sky Kitten was the world's first heavier-than-air airship. In June 2000, it made its tentative debut into the world outside for its maiden flight. It had taken Roger Munk and his team just a few short, tense months to complete it.
Back, one pace to your left. Back through.
And now, this unique British airship, conceived in the very hangar that had housed the mighty British airship 70 years before, was leaving through the very doors that had once opened for the R100. But for the engineers who built it, this was a radically new design for the 21st century. No longer a true airship because it was slightly heavier than air and also shaped like an aircraft, they called it a hybrid air vehicle. Half aircraft, half airship. And now it was ready to take to the air for the first time.
Front first. Okay, gas, Russ.
With its onboard camera, Sky Kitten was ready to record the world's first takeoff of an airship down a runway.
Touch wood, at the moment, everything's working fine. The main thing is just we've got a pretty short takeoff strip with some fairly big obstructions.
Munk knew this was pioneering aviation in the making.
And of course the pilot's taking it up. There's never been anything like this flown in the world before, so it's Wright brothers stuff.
These were the pilots. They would fly the craft by remote control. Because of the controller's inexperience with the craft, Munk decided this would not be an official test flight, but one for the cameras. He needed film of Sky Kitten in flight to show at the press conference the next day. but it was still nerve-wracking.
And everything's about as good as we can get it within the time scale. But right now it's just sheer, pure, deep worry.
Sky Kitten took off, but failed to gain proper airspeed. It started to veer off to one side, just avoiding the press tent, but heading straight for the giant hangar. The pilots had no option but to bring it down as safely as they could. It looked like disaster, but Munk took it in his stride.
Now, come on, just keep it calm. Keep it calm. It's all right.
Munk took control. Sky Kitten would rise again.
Yeah, I think we're going to bring it in here, when we can get it patched up and get it flying again shortly.
In reality, though, they lost the prospect of getting any news film for the press, but gained some useful experience for the proper test flights later. The press tent was on hand for repairs. Munk was totally philosophical about it.
If you want to do something that has more capable than anything done before, it's pioneering stuff, and you better expect that you're going to have problems. I mean, it's going to take probably 3, 4, 5 months of development to get this thing, for the pilots to get used to all the controls. And once they've learned it, it'll be like anything else, straightforward. Anyway, everyone's in good shape, and we'll be fine tomorrow. So work out the exact plan later in the afternoon.
But tomorrow was the press conference. The crash had caused a 30-centimetre long tear in the fabric and some minor damage to a rear engine. It was an impact that would have grounded a conventional aircraft for a week, but this was an airship. Within the hour, it was reflated, and the hull made as good as new. Munk decided not to risk flying it again and make it ready for the press show next day. Sky Kitten was ready for its press debut. The next morning, the arrival of the world's media. Behind the scenes, Sky Kitten's final spruce-ups. Besides the press, major investors had also been invited to come and see the new airship. We asked one of them who he was and how much he'd invested.
Yes, I'm the chairman of the Teller Group, and as far as how much, not enough.
All the staff of Advanced Technologies were on show, from top to bottom. 24 hours before, they had been nursing a wounded airship.
Well, there's supposed to be 300 on it. It does really. I mean, yeah, much as we'd love to finance it, really internal.
To the assembled pressmen, Munk announced a major Skycat construction program stretching years ahead with some big industrial partners.
The systems will be joining us, Pratt & Whitney, and I'm very pleased to see that somebody from Rolls-Royce came here today, and we're delighted to see you. It would be nice if we can get as many Union Jacks on this thing as we possibly can.
But what everyone had come to see was Munk's futuristic new airship, the first major aircraft design of the new century. With Sky Kitten now as good as new again, it and Munk were the stars of the show.
It was good. It was good. We recovered from the minor difficulties of of yesterday in robust fashion. I think we've got to do this thing more frequently, get the whole image up and running, and take on the opposition at their own game.
Southern Germany, July 2000. At Friedrichshafen by Lake Constance, they were celebrating a major airship anniversary. Exactly 100 years before, the first Zeppelin airship had flown here. All the world's airship manufacturers were there, with their airships, including cargo lifter. But Roger Monk's advanced technologies could only display a company stand, with the senior staff doing all the setting up, even the company chairman. Just a few meters away was cargo lifter's own publicity stand. At a press conference, in the absence of Roger Munk, the British company was represented by Chairman Sir John Walker. He stood right next to cargo lifter's Karl von Gablenz, who was keen to convey his airship philosophy.
The lighter than air technology, the value of the technology is the key. It's not the dream to get a big airship back in the air. I think what's driving the community today is much more to really get the use out of this technology. Cargo lifter maybe is one of the first companies who made it more obvious. It's not the technology, it's what you can do with the technology.
In the exhibition area, the world's airship companies prepared to meet the public and industry experts. For the two main cargo airship manufacturers, it was all a matter of competing salesmanship. In November 2000, the cargo lifter hangar was finally completed to house their future airships. The first prototype looks set to fly in 2003. But while that day is eagerly awaited by many industry experts, a few have poured cold water on the whole notion of huge modern airships.
When you look at airships and you look at the various market potentials for airships, there are two that constantly come up because one is very romantic and one is potentially very profitable. The romantic one is, let's build luxury liners that are airships. Let's build great airships like the Graf Zeppelin and fly them, around the world and take people across the oceans. And there have been a number of projects started along those lines. And again, I think that's just the romance of it. The reality is those airships didn't make money in the 20s and 30s, and they're not going to make money today where labor costs are what they are. In fact, it would be even worse, I think, today. And the other one is cargo hauling. There is this notion, again, that within the spectrum of aircraft, that the idea that you could build a heavy lift, slow-flying vehicle, and it's easy to prove that there's a huge market for that if you can do it. So I think investors are willing to see the market. The reality of delivering a vehicle capable of doing that is yet to be realized, and I'm one that remains somewhat skeptical as to whether modern technology has yet yielded the answers that are necessary, if it ever will, to make that possible.
Back in England, the Skycat team were up against it. They already had a small-scale prototype, but the maiden flight had been a failure, and the craft needed modifications. The pressure was on because they had to sell the concept to their most important client, the United States military, for use as a transporter. It had to fly. So in August, Sky Kitten was made ready for a demonstration to a group of US Army generals flying over specially from Washington. Great weather for it, but Munk was worried.
Lovely blue sky, lovely day, but in fact lots of thermals, all severely overscale for the model. Anyway, the generals are about 20 minutes away, and Lou's briefing them about, the extreme turbulence.
Sky Kitten had never before flown in public, and yet Munk was about to show it to his most important customers.
It's a slightly high risk policy. We just could go for gold. How are you?
How are you?
Good to see
I'm
you.
ready. Oh, wait.
Yeah, I've just been doing a little lake building for you, yeah.
That's nice. It's called Lake Munk. Oh, yeah, I brought some army guys here.
Roger, man.
Hi, Roger.
Good to meet you. Very pleased to meet you. And it's a little bit squally with these wind comes over the hangars, so it's like taking off from the lee of the Himalayas, but we'll give it a whirl. Now, we haven't done a takeoff from water before.
Since the first flight, the remote control pilots had now become familiar with the airship's controls. But Munk was playing for very high stakes. Millions of dollars worth of business, perhaps the whole future of the technology, was hinging on whether on this one day a group of US generals would see Sky Kitten fly. But Sky Kitten's proving flight wasn't over. It had to be a perfect touchdown. Sky Kitten was flying for the first time in public in front of 5 Pentagon top brass. For inventor Roger Munk, this was one of the biggest gambles of his life. It had to be a perfect flight and touchdown. Although Sky Kitten was just a 12-meter model, the basic technology of a 300-meter cargo-carrying airship was being proved.
Electric power as well. On. Hovers are on.
That's aviation history, fellas.
Yes, yes.
Now.
Not bad. He's going again.
Sky Kitten's first ever takeoff and landing from water appeared to have gone almost faultlessly. But what was the verdict from professionals?
Well, it's very impressive. These are challenging conditions for this sort of craft.
Having witnessed the proof of the technology, they were already looking ahead to a full-size Skycat in operation.
And the point of delivery. That's the real advantage.
In the hangar, the generals were shown a mock-up of the payload section of a 15-ton carrying Skycat. The 1,000-ton military version would be over 80 meters long.
These sections in honeycomb like we had before, but we have put some extra width.
As the high-powered visitors from the Pentagon inspected the mock-up, Munk knew his huge gamble had paid off.
The focus is to get the military on board, and they're going back absolutely inspired, flat out, to get funding across to us. They think this thing is just a whole new dimension in heavy air transport. And Skycat's not just for the military. There are major civilian commercial markets too, which Munk has already targeted. We've had the Chinese government over here. That's a huge opportunity. China is just the most amazing place for Skycat. All sorts of logistic difficulties, doesn't have a transport infrastructure, burgeoning economy, and this is just the sort of technology they're interested in. So we're looking at doing a licensed manufacturing deal there, and a whole stack of opportunities. It's just a question of chasing them as fast as we can go.
Since that historic flight, the Pentagon has now funded further Skycat development. So, from the hangars that once gave birth to the giant airships of the past, another mammoth airship looks set to rise again, heralding a new era in aviation.